Welcome. My name is Patrick Rael. I am a history professor at Bowdoin College in Maine, and I have prepared this presentation to help college-level history students think about their essays and what they can look like. Let's start by thinking about what an essay in the discipline of history is actually for. A thesis in history explains how or why something happened in the past, or how we should understand something that happened in the past. So we know that our history essays need to have a thesis, some kind of assertion that we will argue. But that assertion should be a response to an explanation of something that happened in the past. Or maybe we're not arguing about why something happened, but how we should understand the something that happened. That thing is the historical phenomenon at the center of your essay. That is the problem, and it's really critical that you have a sense of problem. Very often, student writers think that this will just make things harder on themselves. Why would I elevate my own problem? It just gives me more work to do. That's actually a good thing for you because it will help you structure your essay, as I will show you. So the critical principle here is that your thesis is a response to a problem. Now, it becomes possible when we get better and better at this that our theses will do more than just help explain a problem. They can also help teach us maybe something about the way history works as a discipline, or something about a set of sources, or how we should deal with them, or some larger questions. These are often really good extensions in your paper. They can lead to a strong conclusion or even a second thesis. You can sometimes see a good paper writing process will sometimes show you what the next paper on this topic might look like. This approach is something we might call the problem response model. The notion here is that your paper really consists of two parts: you outlining the problem and then you responding to that sense of problem. That distinction between problem and response is really important. And in the process of writing, it can be difficult to figure out whether what you're talking about at any given point is part of the problem or part of the response. But this is something that we'll work on. This is something you want to be very clear about. The problem is going to break down into chunks, manageable chunks, not 20, but like 3 or 4. And the response is going to break down into a number of manageable chunks as well. The virtue of the system is that once you have this mapped out, the writing process becomes a lot more easy and a lot easier to succeed with, because you know what each paragraph has to do. So this is not a shortcut, but it's not a long cut either. It's not a longer way of doing things. It will actually make you more efficient if you can master this. This is the virtue of this problem response model is also that it is the way that a lot of professional academic scholarship is actually done. I assign essays that model this, and I will try to bring them to your attention when I do. But understanding how to write a paper this way also helps you understand how to read historical scholarship and get through it much more quickly. One of the keys of the system is the introduction, and the introduction to a paper is a really important thing. So I want to step back for a second. We're going to be thinking in terms of introductions, because introductions sort of encapsulate, or should encapsulate, much of the entire paper. One thing an introduction does, perhaps the most important, is that it offers a roadmap of the argument to come. That is a sort of broken down small version of the argument that is to come. You've got to that means introducing the general topic. So when and where are we in history? Who are we talking about? It means introducing the central problem or question that you will be asking about that topic. It may mean explaining the significance of the problem or the payoff of this exercise. So, of course, you're doing this because you have to write a paper for your class, but there should be a bigger significance to the problem. If we're talking about winning World War II, that's a fairly obvious significance, but it might be something more difficult to find initially. It might be that historians have argued about something, or that this is a historical question that is at the basis of modern policy discussion. discussions or something. You may need to explain why this is a problem worth thinking about. And then finally, you want to offer some kind of tentative response to the problem or hypothesis, something that points you in the direction of your final. There's another thing that introductions you'll want to try to do. If you can, you want to convey something about how you will proceed. What will be your sources and methods? So my example here, a simple phrase can do it. A close reading of Abraham Lincoln's speeches suggests that blah, blah, blah. All you're telling me is that you're going to be, your source base is Lincoln's speeches, and that you're going to be reading them closely as opposed to doing some other kind of work like quantitative work. Or you may refer to the structure of your paper to give some hint of the roadmap. Examining the context for the three men's speeches, as a reader, I'm thinking I'm going to see some group of three, perhaps 3 paragraphs, perhaps 3 points in 1 paragraph. But this is what I mean by roadmap. You're giving your readers clues as to what is to come. Of course, you need to know what is to come, which is one of the reasons why the introduction is often something that you finish last. That is an awful lot for one little paragraph to accomplish. So again, this is something that you finalize in the end. You may start with this. It may be helpful to begin with a tentative introduction, but the last thing that you do on a paper should be, before proofreading it, should be to go back over your introduction and see if it matches your actual argument. Many, many papers go awry because the introduction, or because the body of a paper goes in a direction that is not where the intro paragraph goes. Your reader should be able to read that intro paragraph and outline your argument. Okay, so that is a beginning principle here, the significance of these introductions. That will become important here as we discuss the 5-paragraph essay model. This is something that most of us learned as the classic keyhole essay in high school or even junior high school. We know that in this model you have an introduction, 3 body paragraphs or points. Each one is a different point, and a conclusion. And so this is what it tends to look like. Intro, 3 points, conclusion. Just as kind of an aside, this is a guide that might be helpful to you. No paragraphs in your paper should have more than 250 words. If your paragraph is spilling over beyond 1 page worth of words, then it's probably needs to be broken up somehow into 2 paragraphs. Likewise, if each paragraph should be no shorter than 3 or even usually 4 sentences. So between 4 sentences and 250 words. So this keyhole essay is not sufficient for the college level. I'll try to make that evident very shortly, but it can be built into a college level formula. In fact, I think that is a very effective way of beginning your college papers. The key, though, means connecting those points together. Point 1, point 2, and point 3 can't just be a laundry list. There has to be a logical flow to those. So the problems with keyhole essays, let's turn to that now, is that they tend to be formulaic and have disconnected paragraphs. So instead of just having a laundry list of point 1, 2, or 3, we want to connect those paragraphs in some way. And so here are some of the possibilities for that. There's many, many, but you could have 3 paragraphs that go through a chain of causes or causation. This happened, A happened, then B happened, and those led to C happening. Or you could, if you're trying to explain something and you have 3 paragraphs, you might be arranging your paragraphs in order of their explanatory power, right? So the first point will be the point that is least powerful explainer of the phenomenon. The second one will be more powerful explainer, and you always finish with the last most important and powerful explanation. So that's one way. You can arrange your 3 paragraphs as point, counter. Okay, so let's take a look at two examples of a 5-paragraph introduction. And the point here is to say that not all 5-paragraph papers are equal, and to show you what an insufficient 5-paragraph paper is and what a sufficient one might start looking like. So here is our first paragraph. A civil war occurs when two sides in a single country become so angry at each other that they turn to violence. The Civil War between North and South was a major conflict that nearly tore apart the young United States. The North and South fought the Civil War for many reasons. In some cases, these reasons were the same, but in other cases, they were very different. In this paper, I will compare and contrast these reasons by examining the economy, politics, and slavery. So that's one version of this student's paper. Here's another. The United States broke away from England in response to British tyranny and oppression, so opposition to tyranny and a belief in individual freedom and liberty were important values in the young republic. But in the 19th century, slavery made Northerners and Southerners see these values in very different ways. By 1860, the conflict over these values broke out into a civil war that nearly tore the country apart. In that war, both Northerners and Southerners believed they fought against tyranny and oppression, but Northerners focused on the oppression of slaves, while Southerners defended their rights to property and self-government. So you can pause that, take a look at it, and think about what is working effectively in Here's my take on that question. If I was going to outline just on the basis of that introductory paragraph, the first essay, it looks like this. First paragraph of our 5-paragraph essay is this introduction, which is going to lay out the case, which has something to do with the causes of the Civil War. We know that the economy, politics, and slavery were listed, and we're going to have our final paragraph as a conclusion. What exactly we're going to do within each of these paragraphs is not super clear to me because the paragraph wasn't super clear. Let me show you the second paragraph and let's see how that can break down into a much more effective 5-paragraph outline. So the intro paragraph introduces a clear and key concept that the North and South both fought for liberty but understood liberty in different ways. Okay? And again, I invite you to go back to that last and read closely these two paragraphs and see how the second one is giving us so much more than the first. And so one possible way of organizing this, I can imagine, would be this. The first major paragraph is about how Northerners viewed liberty with a focus on the oppression of slaves. The second key paragraph is how Southerners viewed liberty, with a focus on rights of property and self-government. And then how those, in the third point paragraph, how those led to the Civil War. And then you have your conclusion, which basically runs back over that argument. Okay, so what we're going to do now is take that 5-paragraph model and we're going to bump it up a level. So what we're going to do is further complicate the keyhole formula by making a clear distinction between the problem and the response, right? Remember how we talked about that, how critical that distinction is. This is the problem of the paper that I'm setting up, and this is the response or answer to the question that I'm asking. So what's new here is a focus on problem formation, problem creation. It is a difficult academic skill, but it is a really important and critical one, and we should be building it into our papers at every level of college work. So we're used to thinking about this about these papers in terms of thesis. We're told you need an answer, you need a thesis, you need an assertion. And sometimes we're given a prompt, so we know what the question is because an instructor gives it to us. When that doesn't happen, though, and that's one of these higher level skills, as you get deeper and deeper into college level history, it becomes more important to develop your own problems, to formulate your own questions. This is a hard thing to do. It's new for most of us, at least at the college level. But it is a critical thing. And if you can master this, you will succeed in writing. So good problems are key to this whole enterprise. Where do they come from? Critical things here. You have to do reading beforehand to develop a good problem. The first questions you ask of your topic are probably not going to be sufficient to frame a solid, strong argument. So you need to be in conversation with the sources on your topic, whether it's secondary historians, the scholars who've been writing about it, or primary sources, the people who are involved in the actual events themselves. You need to have know something about your topic before you can really hone in on a problem that can support your paper. Good problems yield responses that can be argued with. That is, there may not be a single right answer, just a series of more or less defensible answers, right? You know you're in good terrain when you're not talking about yes or no kinds of responses. You know you're moving toward the right terrain when the questions are ultimately seem insoluble, but can permit a range of possible responses. So, what does that actually look like? Let me offer an example. Let's say we're thinking about World War II. We're thinking about the Pacific Theater, the United States versus Japan, and we're thinking about the end of the war and how the end of the war came about. Here are some questions we might ask. Here's one question. Your first question might be something like this. Did the United States drop 2 atomic bombs on Japan in August 1945? How is that as a problem for that could structure a paper? Think about that for a second. It shouldn't take too long to realize that the problem with this is a fine question to start with, but it's not a thesis problem. Why? Because it yields a one-word answer. Yes. Right? You have a paper consisting of a question and one word, yes. So this might be the starting point, but it is not the end point. So how do you go from these simple fact-based questions to deeper questions? You need to read. Here's a deeper way of asking that question. Okay, we know that 2 atomic bombs were dropped. How were they dropped? What was the actual process by which they were dropped? That too, though, seems to yield kind of fact-oriented results, right? This is not a deep interpretive question yet. Why did the U.S. drop 2 atomic bombs on Japan? That now we're moving into deeper interpretive territory. This is a question over which historians have argued for years. It is not resolved. Ultimately, it may be unresolvable, but that doesn't mean it's not worth asking, and it doesn't mean that some answers aren't better than others. This is the terrain that historians work on. This is the place where your instructors will probably want you to be. An even higher level of this, the one that I am arguing for developing in this talk, is something like this. Why did the U.S. drop 2 atomic bombs on Japan, given that the U.S. could conventionally bomb Japan? So, again, the point is that you need to know something about your topic before you can ask the right questions about it. And that's kind of an irony. We're used to thinking of problems as merely questions, but posing a problem effectively means having already answered some of those questions. So there's a difference between a question and a problem. A question can yield a fact-based answer. A problem is something that is deeper, that can yield a range of interpretations and interpretive possibilities. So this is the hardest thing for me to get students to do. It means that you have to become curious. It means you have to be okay with asking questions, difficult questions, and having them be not fully resolved. You need to be okay stepping into a debate where nobody has perfect information and there isn't one right answer, but some answers are better than others. So being curious is really, really helpful here. So to the extent possible, I advise working on topics that actually interest you. So you'll be motivated to be curious. The good news of all this, the reason why this is actually a good thing is that it will help you to structure your essay. If you can think of problem and response and how they break down into parts, you will find your essay sort of structuring itself. And that is the key to this process. So let's go through that. Okay, let's think about the problem or the process of developing a problem. First, you begin, and this is kind of outlined here, it's going to be a lot messier in practice. You're going to begin with a series of observations about what you are encountering, so you just need to get some basics down. But you need to do this well before you write your final paper. This is only the start of your process. Then you need to see where the questions emerge out of that. Where do your observations yield things that seem startling to you or interesting to you or hard to explain to you? Those will raise questions in your mind that you can pursue with more research. In essence, what you're doing is you're driving your research down a series of smaller pathways. Ultimately, you're going to prune those pathways so that the least interesting questions, the ones that you quickly or easily resolve, those are pruned away. And what you want to be left with are the question streams that are the most interesting, yield the most complicated interpretations, have the most evidence that you can use to bring to bear, because of course it's not helpful to write a paper for which you have no evidence. So this is the process you want to be thinking about. You're going to keep doing this until you narrow your topic to one clear phenomenon that you can address. And oftentimes your instructor can be very helpful in helping you through that process. If you go half the way and come to your instructor's office with some of your observations, some of your interpretive possibilities, they can very quickly help you winnow those down into effective ones. Okay, so let's return to our models and how on these very simple, clear paragraph models that we've got. We've seen the 5-paragraph model where you have an introduction, point 1, point 2, point 3, into the conclusion. I am proposing here a blown up version of that. So a 5-paragraph model is good at yielding a 3 to 5 page paper, probably a 3 to 4 page paper. And that's really good enough for a lot of college assignments. You're not asked to do more than 4. But if you are asked for something richer, something that might be more along the lines of a 7 to 8 page paper, I propose the 9-paragraph model. This gives you a lot more space to work with. And what we've got here is something that looks like this. You've got your introduction as before. Then you have 3 paragraphs, as in the 5-paragraph model, but these are just laying out the problem, right? Then you have what I call a fulcrum, a paragraph in the middle of your paper where you move from problem to thesis. And then you have your 3 parts of your answer. Those are the components of your thesis. And then you have a conclusion. So obviously, by lumping this in terms of 3 problem premises and 3 thesis components is arbitrary. It could be 2 and 2 or different numbers. That is going to affect the size of your paper, though. So a 9-paragraph paper is generally going to come down to a 7 to 8 page paper. You might need to modify this in various ways. The key, though, is this distinction between the problem and the response. All the parts of your paper that explain your phenomenon are going to go in the response. All the ones that set up the problem are going to go in the problem part. That is an important distinction that's actually harder to keep clear in practice than you would think. So let me show you an example. Let's see how this might work in practice. We're going to begin with some initial observations based on our beginning reading. This is another World War II example. Sorry about that. I don't only teach about wars, but these are effective examples. But they could obviously be about any range of issues. So, in fact, I had a student who was working on this in a seminar, and they're interested in the Allied bomber campaigns in Central Europe and Germany late in World War II. And this was the observation that they arrived at. By the end of World War II, Allied bombers were able to use heavy bombers to attack German targets without fear of the German fighter defense. That is an observation. That is a phenomenon. That is a thing that this student was trying to explain. What are the questions that this raises? How do you turn this into a problem? Something like this. Why couldn't the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, successfully defend against Allied bomber attacks? That is the problem version of that observation. So right now, there's a lot of different ways out of that. That's going to make it hard to write this paper. If you just start there, there could be 30, 40 reasons, and you obviously don't have time to do that. So you need a way to make this more manageable, and you're going to have to do some artificial pruning here. It might not feel great, but it is what everyone does who writes papers like this. So how do you narrow that? How do you begin to prune? Well, you need to start making more specific observations. You need to go back into what you began looking at. You're not done with your reading and research. You need to know more about your subject. And what this student discovered in this example was that the Luftwaffe should have been able to defend Germany because it had many advantages, right? So the student had to learn about these advantages. The Luftwaffe had experience with tactical use of air power in the Spanish Civil War, so they were the German Air Corps was active in the Spanish Civil War in the middle of the 1930s, so they were gaining experience. They initially had enormous success against Allied bombing campaigns. They were knocking Allied bombers out of the skies with their fighters. Germany had a very elaborate air defense system of the homeland. There was this grid pattern set up. There was, this had been planned for. The bombing campaigns were not a surprise. The Germans had very good fighter designs, the Bf-109, Focke-Wulf 190. Their German engineering was excellent, and the planes were great. And the Germans alone, among those in World War II, had a doctrine, an approach, a considered, thoughtful approach to how to use their fighters. So these were all observations that emerged from this looping back process of going back into the original question and trying to find answers to it. And essentially what you see what happens here is the question's actually getting harder to answer, right? It seems like the question is getting harder to answer. That's actually a good thing, and I'll show you why soon. So what you start doing is formulating problem possibilities given the rich information that you have. So now we're not just talking about why did the Allied bombing campaign succeed, but why did they succeed given that Germany had a fighter corps that excelled in material quality, experience, and doctrine? Why was it incapable of mounting a defense against Allied bombers by the end of the war? Right? It looks like we've made our problem harder. Now, we did prune 2 points, the air defense system and initial success. We have to do that because we just don't have room to write about everything that we find. So that is okay. You just want to prune the pieces that are least useful, that are least defensible, that are least clear. So let's look at the process at a glance. You have the initial questions emerging from either the prompt you're given or from your reading. You make your initial observations. You're going to research those observations. You're going to try to break those observations down into categories and pursue them. You want to find out more about them. And that's going to yield more observations. Ultimately, you're going to start narrowing pathways. You're going to start pruning your pathways until you wind up with the ones that seem to be the most promising. You're going to keep looping back. So even though you won't be able to, you'll probably have to keep researching even as you're writing if you're like most humans. But you're going to keep looping back in this process. This isn't, I've done my research, now I do my writing. You've got to be continually asking questions, and that is going to start shaping your problem. So the critical thing is to stay in conversation. As you write, you will be chasing down new leads, new possibilities. It's another reason why you really need to give this a little bit of time. This is not a night before solution. This is a week before process, at least. Now, how does all that start turning into paper? How does that structure your paper? I've promised you that it's helpful. It looks hard right now. Let's see how this works. A well-defined problem tells you how to structure your paper because in the same way that a problem breaks down into components, an answer will break down into components. And you have to have an argument that is complex enough to have parts. Too many parts and you lose control, but you need some parts, some parsing of your problem. So imagine this paper as 9 paragraphs, which is a 78-page paper. Each paragraph has an assigned role. And so we're going to return to our model here. You're going to have the introduction, which we've talked about, your problem points, your fulcrum, your response points, and your conclusion. And so this is kind of an advanced keyhole essay here, but that's the basic structure. And I'll show you how what this would look like with this sample that we've been working on here in a second. Oh, so yes, each one of these things is going to be a paragraph, and those paragraphs 100 to 250 words, less than 1 page doublespace and writing. So you can really use this to kind of map out the length of your paper. Okay, so what we've done is begun to develop a problem that is more than just a simple question, that is complex enough that it has parts or components. We're going to do the same thing with a response. We need more than just a 1-paragraph answer. We need a multi-paragraph answer. Now, I'm offering one formula for doing this. Why did X happen despite all the factors suggesting that it should not? That's just one convenient rhetorical form for these arguments. There are many other possibilities, but the critical thing here, and the reason why I like this as a sort of a default, is that it has a clear distinction between problem and response or answer. It's really helpful to think through what you're doing on the page. I really highly recommend having a sort of a journal where you can write. These you're not writing final copy here, you're just writing thoughts. It's astounding how much more complex your thoughts are than you think they are. Very often we think that something that is a one-sentence thought in our head, we're surprised to find that it actually is a paragraph on the page. So thinking on the page, thinking and writing is a really important habit to develop for this. Okay, so let me show you an example, a different example that I devised here. So what I'm talking about here is a 9-paragraph essay on the Civil War and the emancipation of enslaved African Americans. Okay, so that is the sample that we're working with. And so what I'm going to do is show you the introductory paragraph, how I set up the problem, what the fulcrum looks like, and the thesis. I'm going to break this all down and fit it into our 9-paragraph model. This isn't a science, this is an art, so there are many ways of doing this. I don't want you to think that this is the only way of doing this. It is just an effective way. Okay, so let's look at my introductory paragraph, and you can pause this if you need to. I'm going to read it here. Recounting the concluding Civil War in his second inaugural address, President Abraham Lincoln noted that all agreed that slavery somehow was the cause of the war. That how has always been something of a mystery, for 11 states seceded to protect slavery, but those remaining in the Union began the conflict absolutely uncommitted to abolishing it. The public culture of those states was so unabashedly prejudiced that the Republican Party vowed to outlaw slavery not in the states, only federal territories. Even well into the war, Union commanders routinely rendered fugitive slaves back to their owners. Until President Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, that was the law, after all. Given the pervasive racial prejudice of the free states, Lincoln's inaugural promise not to touch slavery in the states, and efforts to return fugitive slaves in the early parts of the war, how do we understand how it became possible to consider an Emancipation Proclamation possible and even advisable? Appreciating how it became possible for Lincoln to declare all slaves in rebellious states forever free, we must understand the military course of the Civil War, and particularly how battlefield stalemates led to emancipation. So, how does this fare against our lenses? The general topic is slavery, the Civil War, the Republican Party, Abraham Lincoln, the Emancipation Proclamation, emancipation of the slaves. That's our sort of general setting for this. It is not yet enough to ask a question. Is this sentence: given the pervasive racial prejudice of the free states, 1, that's 1. 2, Lincoln's inaugural promise not to touch slavery. 3, efforts to return fugitive slaves. Those are my 3 points. How do we understand? These are all things that make it harder to explain how the Emancipation Proclamation became possible and even advisable. So what I'm doing is, it looks like I'm making this problem a lot harder, and that's a good thing. I know the answer, but my reader doesn't know, and that creates a little bit of drama and suspense in this process. The significance of this is indicated here. These are something of a mystery. This is something that people don't understand well, right? So the significance here, such as is posed here, is that this is a problem that has sort of defied easy solution. And so the question we might ask is this enough? In my view, it is. Asking about how something as momentous as the freeing of 4 million slaves happened is itself significant. Explaining that this is not something that all agree on or all have readily settled, that suggests it. This is kind of this is an open question, though. This question of have you explained the payoff of your paper? That's sometimes a hard question to answer. When in doubt, explain why it is important. So the more narrow or obscure, the more we need to explain the stakes of the game. Or the less obvious it is to readers that it is a problem, we need to show that it's a problem, right? So this is really important for getting your reader on board with you. And we also see a tentative conclusion or a hypothesis here, which looks like this: we must understand the military course of the Civil War. So this is the beginnings of a response. It's the hint of a thesis that the answer to this question, what solves this dilemma, is understanding something about the military fate of the war, and particularly battlefield stalemate. We have some sense of where we're going with this. And it clearly responds to the problem that we set up. And we pose this a little bit loosely as kind of hypothesis, and we will have to firm it up later on into a thesis. So this is the initial form of our thesis, but in our paper it will appear at least 2 more times, and we will need to make it more clear and concrete as we go. That'll be easier to do because we'll be doing work and laying out some premises for the reader. Okay, let's see if we can use this introductory paragraph to figure out the structure of this paper. First, we want to think about the problem. Where is the problem in this? And we see that there are sort of 3 pieces or premises to this problem, three givens, things that we already think to be true. That there's popular racism in the North. This seems that there is moderate abolitionism of the Republicans. They didn't want to end slavery before the war. And that even into the war, the Union still supported the persistence of slavery in many respects. So these are all things that make it harder to explain how emancipation happened. Then we want to see if we can identify the parts of the thesis and see how it breaks down. And we can find that in here. The paragraph talks about the understanding the military course of the war, the issue of battlefield stalemate, whatever that is. And then that is somehow going to lead to emancipation. So we do have 3 components of thesis. So let's see if we can find these here. We got our broad topic setting here in blue. So this is just setting the stage. All this orange is the problem, right? This is where we're trying to ask the question and explain why it is a hard question. And then hypothesis, this last green part, this is the only thing in the intro that really points us in the direction of an answer, but it points us in the direction of all 3 components of the answer. So it's there. It's conveyed very concisely. It will have to be unpacked, but all of it is here in the introduction. You can start to see how challenging it is to put a good introduction together. And the other thing I want you to note is how much of this is about simply asking the question. All of that orange is necessary to set up the problem for this paper. Okay, so let's see how this would map out. And our schematics. Here we have our intro and our conclusion. We're used to those from the keyhole essay. Remember, we're going to have our fulcrum that is in the middle. So the intro is going to set up the problem and offer a tentative thesis. The conclusion, the purpose of the conclusion we know is to essentially run back over that roadmap, right? You're going to restate the problem and restate the thesis and possibly point us in the direction of the next question that all this raises or the next problem that this helps us explore. So that is the purpose of a conclusion. And then we've got our fulcrum, and this is the thing we're adding here. So in the middle of the paper, as we go from problem to solution or problem to response, we're going to do the same thing again. So this is going to feel repetitive when you write it, but if you do this effectively, it will not feel repetitive to your reader. It will be good signposts and reminders to your reader about where you are in the argument. So following our introduction, now we're going to have our 3 problem premises. These are all things. And remember, our question is, how is it that we got to emancipation? How do we get to a place where we freed 4 million slaves? And this early part is showing us how hard that question is, right? How did we free those slaves despite that there was so much racism in the North before the Civil War, despite that the Republicans and Lincoln actually were only against the extension of slavery, not its legal existence in the states where it was, and that Union government supported slavery well into the war. These are all things that make it harder to explain the ending of slavery. And so we're going to run through those in the first part of our paper, and then we're going to hit the fulcrum, which is essentially a restatement of our introduction. It'll be slightly different, as I'll show you an example of that later on. And your reader will now be going, gee, how did we get to ending slavery given all of these things? And then you'll answer with these responses. One, we have to understand the military course of the war, so there's going to be a paragraph about that. Specifically, we need to understand the problem of battlefield stalemate, which I'll explain in a minute. And then emancipation became a solution to the problem of battlefield stalemate, right? So here is our entire argument in miniature. So, and this is what our problem paragraphs might look like. Remember, we have those 3 points at the beginning of the thesis. So this is what the topic sentences might look like. So we do our introduction, then our first problem paragraph would begin with this. Even a brief examination of print culture in the antebellum North suggests a society deeply suffused with racist notions of black people's inferiority, right? So remember our first premise of our problem was this notion that there was widespread racism throughout the North. It wasn't like the North was a land filled with abolitionists who wanted slavery dead. So this is going to be our first paragraph. Second, this one has to do with the moderate anti-slavery of Lincoln and his Republicans. So unconcerned with the fate of African Americans were most Northerners that the most successful anti-slavery party of the time could not manage to argue for the abolition of slavery in the Southern states. So again, the rest of that paragraph is going to support that point. And then third, even well into the war, the antebellum fugitive slave law remained in force, signaling the federal government's ongoing commitment to protect slavery. So each topic sentence is going to constitute a kind of mini thesis. It is the argument for its paragraph. And each paragraph will require a miniature argument. You will probably need evidence from primary and or secondary sources. You will need some of your own thinking to explain what those mean. And you might have a sort of a mini conclusion for that argument, for that paragraph, or a transition to the next paragraph that is to follow. Paragraphs are critical. You're not thinking in terms of pages or words. You're thinking in terms of paragraphs. The paragraph is the foundational block of your essay. It is the key unit that you will work in. When you're making an argument in a paragraph, you want in your paper every argument that pertains to that topic sentence in that paragraph and nothing that doesn't pertain to it outside of it. Okay, now what comes next is the fulcrum. So here it is, and I'll leave it up here for a second. You can pause this and kind of read it. What you'll note is that it is effectively a rewriting of the introduction. There's really not much here that's not there. What's different, though, is that I can now refer more confidently, more explicitly to the problem itself. So the fulcrum does the same work as the introduction, but it comes at a different place. So the intro looks down into the paper that is to come. The fulcrum, the first half of it, looks up to review the problem that was just given. Then it reposes the central problem. So again, we get another sort of statement of thesis question here. And then it's going to look down to introduce the thesis. And we can often do this now in fuller form because readers have learned a little bit more. Okay, so your intro looks down into the paper, your conclusion looks up into the paper, the fulcrum looks both ways. First part of it up, last part of it down. And what you're doing here is you're reminding your reader. Your reader's like, oh, okay, here is our roadmap. You're reminding me where I am in your argument. Okay, now let's turn to those three response or thesis paragraphs and look at the topic sentences that will introduce them. First, the Republicans in charge of the Union war effort began the conflict expressly committed to protecting the right to hold human property in the slaveholding states. So this is saying that establishing at the beginning of the conflict there was support for slavery even by the Union government that was prosecuting the war. Second point, and it's possible that slavery would not have been touched had the war not stalemated. But when the battlefield failed to produce decisive political results, Union leaders began attacking the Confederacy in new ways by attacking slavery. So this refers to a point that we explore in my Civil War class. But basically what happens in the Civil War is that it was a very, very bloody conflict. And for a lot of reasons we don't need to go into here, it was almost impossible for a victory on the battlefield to turn into a political victory, right? So in the age of Napoleon just 50 years earlier could fight one battle and take over an entire country. That was impossible during the Civil War. A lot of it has to do with technology and some other kinds of factors. The critical thing is that the battlefield stalemated. It broke down. And even very costly or very successful victories had a hard time changing the political tides of the war. And then third, the emancipation was the solution to this problem. African Americans serving the Union cause offered and helped achieve a decisive Union victory and total emancipation. So the answer to the problem of stalemate was emancipation. That is the case that we're making here. And this is what explains, despite all the factors mitigating against emancipation becoming a wartime Union aim, these are the factors that actually did lead it to become a wartime Union aim. Now, it should be possible for me to just pluck out the topic sentences of each of your paragraphs. I should be able to read your intro, fulcrum, and conclusion and topic sentences and be able to see what that roadmap is. If those topic sentences are not matching what's in the intro, or if the fulcrum and the conclusion and intro aren't matching up, then we have some problems. So you want to focus, those topic sentences are often the first sentence of each paragraph. So you want to focus on strong topic sentences that set the tone for that paragraph, that make the argument. And look, when you're writing this thing, you might have to write the paragraph first before you really understand what that topic sentence is. That's fine. That's what real writers do. So in the same way that you're going to revise your introduction as the last part of the paper you write, you want to revise your topic sentence as the last part of each paragraph you write. Go back to it and see if that topic sentence conforms with reflects the argument that the paragraph itself makes. If it doesn't, it needs revision. And you want to be looking to see how historians do this same thing. They are your models, so follow them. And we're going to end our paper with a conclusion. So this is it, and you can pause it again and take a look at it. I think one of the critical things, I'd say here is that it is essentially doing the same work that the intro and the fulcrum have done. There might be a little more detail in here because our reader has learned a little bit more. This conclusion is also going to have a piece that suggests the next problem. So once my paper has solved this problem, what does that help us solve? What bigger problem does that help us solve, or next problem? So we are again reprising the introduction and the fulcrum, but this time we are looking up back into the paper that we've just completed, because there's nothing to follow, of course. We're going to repose that central problem as we do here. We're going to go back over the solution. So what we're doing is we're running through our roadmap again very quickly and concisely. Again, it may feel repetitive to us. It will not to our reader. It will be to our reader, this signals, oh, this has been repeated. This is key. And as in the blue here, we might extend the conclusion with this reference to the next problem that this might help us solve. If you don't have a real conclusion, please don't just do a silly throwaway, and we still have racism today kind of thing. This should point, if you can point to an actual problem, great. If you can't, don't be too fussy about it, and don't put it in. It will look obviously like you're just throwing it in. So that is our paper outlined in a nutshell. We have a structure now. We have a roadmap that we can use to write this paper. Now, instead of staring at 8 blank pages of paper, you just have to work on one paragraph at a time, and you know what each paragraph has to do. Making this all happen is, of course, a little bit harder than it looks. In practice, we often only figure out what our thesis is by working backward. In other words, we often wind up with our key question only when we've figured out what the answer to it is, right? So we find something interesting, and then we sort of reverse engineer the problem that it solves, right? So If that makes no sense to you, don't worry about it right now. But if most of our actual thinking and writing experience doesn't happen problem solution. That's the way we want to structure a paper. That's the way a paper might read, but that's not how we work, right? So what you're looking for is something that could be a possible thesis. And something that could be a possible thesis is that it helps us understand some kind of puzzle or conundrum. It helps us unpack a problem. So you're thinking in terms of, oh, here are my problems, what is my answer? But you're also thinking in terms of, here are some possible answers. What are the problems that they might solve? What are the good problems, the complicated problems, the deep interpretive problems they might help us solve? So I've sort of presented to you in a kind of formulaic way. First do this, then do this, then do that. But the answer, the fact of the matter is that writing is a very organic process. It's often very personal, and we all have our own approaches. The key is that there are some basic principles here that are really useful to return to when you get stuck. When you don't know what comes next, when you feel like you're flailing and don't have a direction, return to these basics. What is my topic? What about it is problematic? Is it significant? Why is it significant? Because it helps us with a policy problem, because it helps resolve a long-standing debate. Maybe there's a significance we haven't even seen yet. What is the response or thesis that helps explain it? And then, how does that structure my paper? If I understand my question and its parts and my response and its parts, I have structure. So what I suggest is that before you actually start writing your draft, try to construct that roadmap. How can I break my problem down into 3 or however many related pieces or givens, things that seem to make the problem harder? And how does my response break down into 3 related components? In essence, this means that your fulcrum through conclusion are kind of a 5-paragraph paper. What we've really added here is the problem. And that is so critical because it's you coming up with your own problems. That is the work of really doing academic investigation, right? It's relatively easy when you're given a prompt. When you're not given a prompt, when you have to figure out what the question is that emerges from your work, that's a harder thing to do. But that payoff is so much greater. It displays such a much stronger effort to engage the material. I highly recommend that you approach it that way. Okay, good luck with everything, and I hope your papers are all successful.